Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started here. We have a lot to cover tonight. I want to welcome everyone back to tonight's LaRouche PAC discussion and our class series that we have been holding for, I think now the past 4 weeks. This is the fourth class in our class series, and I'm Keisha Rogers. I'm joined tonight by Tony Pappert and Ben Deniston. And as for those who have been joining us in our previous classes, you probably have gotten a sense that we are educating the leaders of leaders to understand what it really takes to bring forward the American system of political economy. And the class series that has started with Tony Pappert and who's going to get us started on this discussion tonight, and it has been titled Death by Globalization or Renaissance of Our American System, which is very appropriate in the context of what the LaRouche PAC has launched as a critical campaign to educate the American people on how we get out of the current economic crisis and the collapse that we're seeing. The class series started actually with Susan Kokinda that presented, and I'm going to name these out because I want to make sure that for those who may be joining us for the first time or who want to go back and look at these, that you know what they are. So we have how the American system defeated fascism. Susan Kokinda led that one, followed by Tony Pappert with Death by Globalization or a Renaissance of Our American System. Last week's discussion was led by Brian Lance. It ain't supply chains, it's what we don't produce. And this week's discussion, as I said, will be led by Ben Deniston on American infrastructure. Does anyone remember when we used to think big? This one's going to be a lot of fun. The subtitle of this is Biden's $3.5 trillion bogus bill or real nation building. And I'm sure that that's on a lot of people's minds right now, what's going on with the fiasco in the Congress, the infrastructure bill. And we'll get into that, I'm sure, but we're going to get a little bit deeper into the question of what people have to understand about a concept that Ben will bring up on platforms, economic platforms, as LaRouche understood, versus all of this discussion about infrastructure. And so that will be a very important discussion. Now, I do want to say that this is all being done in the context of our campaign to push a resolution for calling for the re-Americanization of the US economy. And to understand why this resolution is important, you have to understand what it means to re-Americanize the US economy. What is the American system of political economy? These are not just terms that we're throwing around here. This is essentially what our nation was built on. And we'll get into that now. I do want to say we've been having a lot of fun. I think a couple of weeks ago, I reported back, and some LaRouche PAC organizers, along with myself, were at the Trump rally in Perry, Georgia, and we started then getting out the resolution and getting a tremendous response. And tonight, as we speak, we have quite a team down over in Ohio, where President Trump is speaking tonight, and getting a tremendous response, again, as said, on our resolution to re-Americanize the US economy. So with that, everyone who's joined us tonight, the last thing I want to say is, before I turn it over to Tony, is that I would ask people tonight, so we can have an engaging discussion, that everyone who has a question, put your questions in the Q&A. Otherwise, I would definitely ask you when it's time to ask your question or make a comment, that everyone participates by either calling into the phone line by pressing *9 or by clicking the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen when the presenters are done speaking. Otherwise, if you have a question, let's keep the question separated from the Q&A, or should I say from the chat. and let's get the discussion started tonight. Okay, so with that, Tony, why don't you go ahead and get us started for tonight's discussion?
I just wanted to fill in a little bit from what Keisha said of situating tonight's class and the whole series. As she said, we began, the first one was Susan Kokinda on the real story of the US economic mobilization for World War II as in a very different time and place, but providing lessons for exactly what we have to do today to mobilize against the collapse into shambles of our economy, which we see right at this moment, pushed further and faster by the green policies of Joe Biden, even though his multi-trillion-dollar bills have not been passed by the Congress and may never be. So that we began 3 years ago, the World War II mobilization, 3 weeks ago, the World War II mobilization. 2 weeks ago, I set forth a forecast which Lyndon LaRouche had made in 2005, that at just about this time, the continued process of globalization, if it was allowed to continue, would result in a physical economic breakdown collapse of the US economy. And this is precisely what's happened. He said, actually, I mean, infrastructure played a key role, as if you go back and watch that, you'll see. But he said, triggered by a collapse in infrastructure, which we're experiencing now as we speak, the physical economy would come tumbling down. And that's what's happening. And I also tried to explain the basis in thinking of LaRouche and his economics and his economic forecasts, which underlay that forecast, and which is totally different from the farcical varieties of classroom economics which are taught in our schools today and talked in our newspapers. So that was 2 weeks ago. And then last week, Brian Lance went into the inside of that ongoing collapse due to globalization and went through in strictly physical terms. I mean, it's not a question of dollars, it's not a question of money, it's a question of physical economy. He went through in strictly physical terms the way the economy is collapsing around us and began to discuss what we have to do to build it back. Now, today we have with us, as you see, Ben Deniston, who actually, whether he says so or not, he personally worked with Lyndon LaRouche on some of these concepts of infrastructure, which Lynn reworked during the early part of this century before he died in 2019. So I know Ben is going to, as Keisha said, Ben is going to introduce us to Lynn's concept of what is called infrastructure, which is totally different from the rest of what you see in here. And I think he's going to close by showing us some of the directions that we can take and must take in infrastructure in its relationship to the whole US and world economy when we take over, when we patriots take over again with Donald Trump from the treasonous group that's presently ensconced in Washington, D.C. So I just wanted to, as Keisha did also, give some introduction situation so that you can see where what we're saying fits in. And if you haven't seen them, these other classes are available to you on our website. So Ben.
Thanks, Tony. Glad to be part of this series. Thanks, Keisha, for the introduction there. I think it should be a fun discussion today. I prepared some slides. I'm just going to jump right over to that, and we can look at what I got for the discussion today. So just to get it right off the bat, we do want to just address this Biden agenda. Biden's Build Back Better bill he's trying to get through the Congress, his whole policy, as we've been saying, other people have been saying, you know, this is largely really a cover for the Green New Deal and associated radical ideologies, which would destroy this country. We should just be clear on that right up front. I thought, you know, despite all the talk about infrastructure, you know, improving people's lives, all that, you know, there's smatterings of, you know, some handouts, a bunch of handouts throughout the bills, but the core policy is this crazy radical green environmentalist policy. Despite what they say about infrastructure. It's not really about infrastructure, and it's especially not about infrastructure in any kind of competent sense, that'll be the core of the discussion today. But I saw an article on Vox from the other day, which I thought, you know, just let the cat out of the bag pretty clearly. It was kind of a panicked article saying that they have to pass Biden's agenda, otherwise we're not going to have a chance to quote unquote address the climate crisis, whatever the heck that's supposed to mean. So they said in this article, Democratic leaders are trying to pass two major pieces of legislation, the $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill and the up to $3.5 trillion Build Back Better Act, that they say can slash US pollution by up to 45% in the coming decade. In the outlined Build Back Better Act, Congress would flex its power to transform the electricity sector so that it runs on mostly clean energy, right? So that's what these hardcore advocates of the Biden policy are pushing for. This Green New Deal program, right? Allow the Congress to flex its power to transform the electricity sector so that it runs mostly on clean energy, right? And they use these words that really are meaningless. They're just made up phrase. Clean energy. What is clean energy? Well, by clean energy, they mean no CO2. Well, the whole biosphere runs on CO2. So I don't know what's not clean about CO2. When they say reduce pollution by up to 45%, they're referencing CO2. CO2 is not a pollutant, right? It's insane. But they're pushing this radical policy to reduce, to have quote unquote clean energy. And by clean energy, they don't mean nuclear. They don't mean hydro, even though those are, you know, zero CO2 emission sources of electricity. They mean largely wind and solar, right? The most expensive, the least reliable, the least efficient source of electricity you can possibly get. They want to ramp up the total percentage of US electricity generated from wind and solar upwards of 50, 80%. You know, that's what they're actually trying to get established. If they get their way fully, they'd say 100% in a ridiculous amount of time, right? 2030, 2050. That would destroy the country, right? And we're not talking about hypotheticals here. This is already has been demonstrated and is being demonstrated in many cases. I personally like this illustration here. It's from a few years ago. I think it shows the case pretty darn clearly. You have a scatter plot here, a way to show the relation between two factors and to show if there's an actual dynamic or causality involved between those two factors, right? So one factor is electricity prices, right? That's on the vertical axis here, residential electricity prices. On the horizontal axis, it's how much wind and solar has been installed per person in each country, right? So the question is there a relation between the amount of wind and solar you install and the cost of electricity? And if you take all these countries in Europe and you plot them out according to these relations, it's pretty damn clear there's a very direct relation. The more wind and solar you put in for base load electricity in your country, the higher the cost of electricity, right? With Germany and Denmark leading the way, right? And this is having devastating effects for a number of years. In Germany, for example, productive industries have been leaving because they can't afford the electricity prices and so on. So, you know, for reasons we've discussed in other classes, I'm not going to get into all the breakdown here. But bottom line, wind and solar, it's low energy flux density. It's an inherently low concentration of energy per unit area available to access. So you have to build these monstrosities of complexes of windmills, solar panels, huge arrays, just to try and capture enough electricity. And then you have the intermittency issue, right? The sun sets every day, gets cloudy, you get storms, the wind picks up and goes down, right? It's just a catastrophe, right? So if you add a little bit, if you add a little bit of wind and solar, you don't see the effects that much. But when you start pushing into higher and higher percentages of your total electricity provided by wind and solar, you start to see dramatic effects, you know, as Denmark, Germany, and other places are showing us already. We don't have to look at Europe, we can look at the United States. California. California has been pushing to shut down coal, shut down nuclear power, right? Even though nuclear, again, it's zero CO2 emissions, but they're still wrapped up in this crazy green ideology that is shutting down nuclear power, right? And dramatically ramping up wind and solar, really forcing the mass implementation of wind and solar power. And what are the results? Well, over the last 10 years, the rate of electricity price increase is 7 times higher in California than the rest of the country on average, right? And California is currently only at 15% of the electricity consumed coming from wind and solar, right? And it's already seen this dramatic increase in price just from that much being allocated to wind and solar. You start talking about 40%, 50%, 80%, attempting to put that much, cover that much of your electricity needs with wind and solar. It can't happen. You can't have an economy, functional economy running on that. The cost would be so high, it would force a collapse in other parts of the physical economy, right? And this is a subject of discussion. You know, California is already known for incredibly high poverty rates. Here's an interesting study I was just looking at the relation between the growing electricity costs being a significant factor in driving up that poverty issue, right? And again, this is where we're at currently before this insane, what would be a completely insane and devastating Biden Green New Deal agenda, which would try and push this so much dramatically further, right? And all of this is happening as we're looking at basically a global energy crisis. This is Bloomberg today, right? People have probably been seeing the headlines. Europe is having all kinds of issues, low wind, causing major drop in the wind power. Natural gas prices are shooting up globally, right? Coal shortages are hitting, right? China's facing energy crises, electricity crises. So the world is facing a major electricity crisis, you know, because it's gone along with this green policy, even in a limited form for the past, you know, decades. Whereas what LaRouche was calling for, what LaRouche PAC has been pushing and is still pushing, is to go heavily nuclear. You know, fossil, let that expand as far as it can. You know, there's still room for growth. We can still expand the use of coal, natural gas, oil, whatever, but that's got a limited capability. The real future, the primary energy source for electricity, but energy more generally, is going to be nuclear power for the world in the future, right? That's what we need to be going towards. If we had done that, if we had implemented LaRouche's policy, you would not be facing the present global electricity and energy crisis right now. And if they go with this Green New Deal, you have the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change having their new push for their new conference coming up soon, pushing for their carbon reduction agenda, right? So if the world in this state, the fragile state of the world economy currently, if they go with this program, it's going to be a catastrophic death spiral for the physical economy, right? So we have to resist this, and the United States really is going to play a central role, starting with defeating Biden's Build Back Better agenda, the Green New Deal agenda, right? So that's what we're facing. On the negative, people see that, people are fighting against that. We need to continue that mobilization, continue that fight. I'm hopeful that we can defeat these bills, defeat this agenda. People are facing the physical reality of what's happening under those policies, right? But at the same time, we also need a real perspective for how to work towards the future, build our way out of this crisis, right? Just defeating more bad policies is not going to ensure that we create a better future for our country, for the world, for our children, for our grandchildren, right? We need a positive conception of the kind of economic policies that are going to bring us there. So when Tony was talking to me about how to compose this class series, what he thought I could add, we really wanted to make sure that Mr. LaRouche's unique conception of infrastructure was presented as part of this discussion, right? What is the role of infrastructure in building an economy, advancing an economy, or in Mr. LaRouche's term, increasing the potential relative population density of society, facilitating the anti-entropic growth and development of mankind, of the human species. Infrastructure plays a very critical, unique role in that process. And Mr. LaRouche, around 2010, around that period, started introducing a new term, which he was calling the infrastructure platform, a physical economic platform, to help illustrate a different idea, a more accurate and more truthful and a more fundamental conception of infrastructure. So this is from a 2010 broadcast he gave on LaRouche PAC on our YouTube channel, where he said, when you're investing in infrastructure, you're not just investing in something to make things more convenient. It's not like building highways the way we're building highways in recent times. Infrastructure enables mankind to increase the quality and qualitative feature of productivity of labor as a qualitative step upward. And therefore, infrastructure as such, when it's applied in this way to mankind, introduces a qualitative leap upward in the possibility of productive economy. That is, agriculture and industry depend for their improvements based largely on this factor of basic economic infrastructure as I've just defined it. So it's kind of in a very simple sense, the core of the thesis of Mr. LaRouche's views here. You don't just have industry by itself, companies by themselves, productive enterprises by themselves, just completely creating their own potential for existence. You have the role of infrastructure, which creates the overarching potential for the physical economy, for productivity to even occur. So the role of infrastructure is to constantly create new levels of potential productivity that will advance the economy as a whole. And that is really more of the causality of what's happening. Price, the costs of things, when seen from this physical economic standpoint, is an effect. It's a shadow of this process, right? We were just looking at the costs of electricity in the context of a green infrastructure, green electricity program, right? Costs are going up because wind, solar, as a growing percentage of your electricity infrastructure platform, lowers the physical potential of your economy. It lowers the physical productivity, your ability to produce electricity at higher rates more efficiently is lowered as if in a physical sense through the larger implementation of wind and solar. We've discussed that in more detail in other classes. But the costs we're seeing, what you end up seeing as the cost, the monetary cost, is a shadow, it's an effect of these kinds of physical processes, physical changes. And what we want to talk about tonight is infrastructure as a potential field. Infrastructure as shaping the environment in which the economy occurs, shaping the environment, creating the ability to have industries, or to have industries have a certain level of productivity, or exist in a certain part of the country, or be able to interact across certain regions of the territory, right? The ability to have a productive enterprise, agriculture or manufacturing, what have you. How productive those private initiatives can be is determined by the overall infrastructure field, potential field of the economy as a whole. Now, just to give people kind of a simplistic analogy as to what we're talking about when we say a potential field, you can look at things like magnetic fields. A magnetic field, a potential field determined by a magnet. This is just a graphic I was able to pull out of a presentation I found on YouTube. This guy was looking at different shaped magnets, putting them under a piece of graph paper, and then you sprinkle iron filings. The iron reacts to the magnetic field of the magnet, and the iron filings take the shape of the magnetic field created by the magnet in that area. And you get a sense that there's a structure created, a field created by this presence of this magnet. Whatever structure, whatever magnets you put into this environment, if you add new magnets, change what types of magnets you're putting in, you get a different layout of the field. You get a different dynamic. The way the iron filings organize themselves and the pathways they create and the structures they create respond to the overall field as a totality, right? As we can see in a few examples here, right? Here you can see a different orientation of the magnets structured together. Now you get a different shaped field. So this is, again, a simplistic analogy, but think about the economy, think about infrastructure in a similar way. It creates the overall shape of the environment in which the economy operates, in which the individual operates and acts, right? What options are available? What are the potential levels of profitability you can achieve? What are the costs going to be to you? A lot of these are outside of your control as an individual actor. They're determined by the level of the infrastructure platform that's been created in the economy, right? So we'll use this as just a rough example. You know, you can get a lot more sophisticated in terms of potential fields. This is something that, you know, Bruce Director, one of our associates, worked very closely with Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche very much enjoyed working with Mr. Director on these concepts of potential fields, and you start to get into the work of Gauss, Riemann, these levels of higher mathematics that can express these kinds of higher levels of physics, physical reality, and how that begins to become the necessary basis if you really want to understand the underlying dynamics of economy, right? So there's a lot in there. I'm using a very simple example, but I hope that, you know, basic analogy makes sense, right? That the infrastructure creates a potential field for the economy. And this is how the United States was actually built, in fact, right? This is not just theoretical thing that we're throwing out there. This is the reality of how the United States developed. Transportation systems, power systems, water systems. Mr. LaRouche would usually highlight these three as your core pillars of an infrastructure platform. Transportation, water, power. If you invest in these, if you develop new capabilities in these systems, then you transform the overall capability of a certain territory of your economy, or your economy as a whole, as a totality, or the global economy as a totality. So let's look at some specifics. Let's look at some actual case studies, right? Some of these are things that we've looked at before. I really like these studies of the changing transportation times throughout the development of the US economy. So we have what you call an isochronic map. Iso meaning the same, chronic referring to times. So here you have a series of isochrones, lines that depict a certain time it takes to travel that distance, in this case from New York City, right? So each successive line, weirdly shaped line emanating out of New York City here indicates another day's worth of travel to get that far if you're trying to travel from New York City to somewhere else, right? So here we are in 1800, pretty much nearly the beginning of the country, right? Not too long after the American Revolution. Still very beginning infancy of our nation, still getting our act together. And you get a sense of, if you wanted to travel from New York to Lake Erie, for example, to Buffalo, New York, to connect into the Great Lakes, or if you wanted to go down south, how long would it take for you to travel, for you to transport goods, for you to get goods from somewhere else, right? This is the travel time under the economy at that time in 1800. So just to highlight a couple references, New York City to Buffalo, 1800, that's a 9-day trip. New York City to New Orleans, if you want to head all the way down to the south into the Gulf, that's a 26-day trip as a function of the transportation infrastructure in 1800. And at that point, you're talking about some limited roads for stagecoaches, right? Horse-drawn transportation systems. Those existed from, roughly around Boston, Massachusetts in the north, down to Richmond, Virginia in the south. So it covered a limited, not too far inland. So you had some very limited stagecoach roads, and you had certain limited ability to traverse some of the rivers to travel throughout the country, but not a whole lot. That was 1800. From 1800 to 1830, you had a massive investment in developing canal systems, canal infrastructure. This is described in one report saying the period between 1800 and 1830 was one of rapid development of water transportation and the extension of highways. It marked both the development of the steamboat as a means of transportation and the completion of the Erie Canal. Now on this map here, we see the major river systems in the eastern United States, into the central part of the United States. And in the dashed lines, you see the canals that have been developed by 1830. And the one straight across New York, straight across upstate New York, running east-west, that's been highlighted in a thicker line there, that's the Erie Canal. And that was a kind of keystone project that linked the whole eastern, northeast coastal regions and some of the limited river waterways that were available there, Hudson River and so on, into the Great Lakes, which then through other canals connected down to the Ohio River and down in the Mississippi River. So you had kind of this keystone central connection that really was the leading example, the leading component of this massive development of canal systems as a new infrastructure system, which transformed the ability to travel throughout the country. It transformed the potential of the economy of the country at that time. So if you go now, a generation later, 1830, we have a completely changed isochronic map for travel times throughout the country. New York City to New Orleans, that's now 14 days down from 26 days, almost half the time. New York City to Buffalo is now 4 days, down from 9 days. The cost of freight, to move freight from Buffalo to New York, went from $100 a ton to $10 a ton, a 10-fold decrease in cost. Why? Not because of any monetary policy, not because they printed money or took money out of circulation or created Bitcoin or had gold or silver or whatever, right? Cost is a function of physical economic processes, realities. A higher infrastructure platform lowered the cost of transportation, enabled a far more connected, more rapidly connected economy relative to the stage prior, right? So 1830, you're at the platform of these canal systems connecting the eastern into the Midwest regions of the country. By 1857, you had the development of significant railroad systems, at least from the eastern and the southeastern into the Midwest and South. The result of the development of the railroads in the second quarter of the 19th century and their extension westward to the Mississippi River and into southern Wisconsin is shown here. So just to keep looking at our references, New Orleans was 26 days, pre-canal era, colonial era. It went down to 14 days. New York City to New Orleans, almost cut in half, 14 days as a function of canals interconnecting river systems. And then as a function of the railroad development, as of 1857, it's down to 5 days. So 1/3 cut down from what it was prior to the development of this early stage of railroads. Buffalo was 9 days in the colonial era. Canals brought it down to 4 days. Now with these rail systems, by 1857, less than a day to get from New York City to Buffalo. Just to highlight a couple examples, right? So dramatic increase again in the connectivity of the economy. And then by 1870, you had the landmark completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And now we're connecting the entire country. So this is what the rail network looked like by 1870. Extensive development in the whole eastern half of the country. And the initial transcontinental railroad completed, connecting the two coasts of the country for the first time. And now you have transportation by 1930, in this case, solely by railroads. Now transcontinental travel, traveling from the East Coast across the entire country to the West Coast. When we started this examination, going back to the colonial era, it was like a 3 to 6 week trip, right? You'd be lucky if you got it done in a month, right? It could very easily take you a month and a half, if not longer, to travel across the country, right? Just think about that for a second, right? How disconnected you are, how disconnected the country is, right? In that scenario, what's the economic relation between these parts of this vast country of ours, right? Incredibly low, incredibly diminished, right? With the Transcontinental Railroad, now you're down to 3 or 4 days by 1930 to get across the country, right? And that's for people, but that's also for freight, for goods, right? Opening up all kinds of new potential for production, mass production. You could produce goods in mass in one place, get them efficiently to another place where they could utilize them, right? So transportation systems became a key backbone in developing the capability of the entire economy to become what it became and what it's become, right? So it's that created the potential field for the economy to exist. And it really transformed, in a very fascinating way, what the individual's relation to the economy was as a whole. There's other studies, I don't have it shown here, but you can see over time, over the same kind of time frames from like 1800, up to today, how the average amount traveled per person in the economy has been steadily increasing, during advancing times at a geometric rate, at incredible rates. I'm sure that stagnated in the economic failures of the recent 20, 30, 40 years. But the sphere of area encompassed by an individual in his daily actions, in his work, in his leisure, in his travel, is dramatically increased as a function of these systems. Just, has a profound economic and also cultural effects, right? So again, we want to think about these as an expression of an overall field that determines the capabilities, what can happen, how things can happen, how efficiently things can happen, what the cost of things are in the economy as a totality, right? That's the role of infrastructure. That's transportation. Take power, take energy, right? Just to highlight one interesting example. Here we're looking at Washington State. You go back to the Great Depression, the World War II period, the Franklin Roosevelt era, and you have the development of hydroelectric power on a large scale for the first time, right? Major development. In Washington State, in the Northwest, you had the Bonneville Dam. It's a major development by 1937. 1942, here you see here shown depicted the Grand Coulee Dam. Major dam systems controlling significant rivers, providing for the first time abundant, relatively cheap, and consistent and steady electricity through hydroelectric power, right? You know, we've come a long way. Really today, you know, the future of electricity generation power is nuclear. You go back a century, hydroelectric power was a major leap forward, right? Not just for providing electricity, but the consistency, the steady and large availability of electricity was a major development at the time. And this led in Washington State and in the Northwest to a very interesting development. We had the development of a major center of aluminum production. And it peaked at about 40% of the entire US capacity for aluminum production was just in this Northwest region, right? And the peak was like 6 or 7% of the entire world capacity. Why historically did that develop in the Northwest? These hydroelectric power systems had a direct role in that happening. Aluminum is relatively energy intensive to produce. If you're going straight from the ore, you got to separate the aluminum. It's especially at that time, it was very highly energy intensive relative to the economy at the time. So the ability to produce aluminum en masse required abundant, cheap, consistent electrical power. You had it with hydropower for one of the first times. That led to an explosion, the development of an entire aluminum production industry in the Northwest. Well, what came along with that? The aerospace industry. As one article reported, Boeing, which was building warplanes in Seattle, was a primary customer for aluminum from Northwest smelters. It has been estimated that electricity from the Grand Coulee Dam alone provided the power to make the aluminum in about 1/3 of the planes built during World War II. So I'm sure most people are familiar, aluminum is a lighter metal, doesn't weigh as much. It still can be relatively strong. So aluminum was a central component to the development of airplanes and the broader aerospace industry. So Boeing played a central role in developing an entire aerospace industry in the Northwest, utilizing the vast aluminum production capabilities there, brought by the hydropower, brought by the cheap, abundant, available electricity, to the point that during World War II, I assume this is just referring to US production, which is astounding. If it's talking about global production, that's even more astounding, but I don't know. I'm not sure which they're referring to here, but they said the electricity from the Grand Coulee Dam alone. So just from the Grand Coulee Dam's electricity generation, that provided the power to make the aluminum in about 1/3 of all the planes built during World War II. Again, I'm assuming US production, but that's amazing from one infrastructure project, one dam. Another article goes on to say over the last 100 years, again, referring to Washington, talking about the Northwest here, over the last 100 years, the state's aerospace industry has led the world in innovation, pushing the envelope in design, engineering, materials, and production. Washington is the birthplace of Boeing, which has spawned a robust supply chain of more than 1,300 companies that manufacture parts, systems, and structures, meeting the needs of every major aircraft manufacturer and airline in the world. Now, this is not necessarily at the peak it was, if you go back a few decades, but this is still a very strong presence in the Northwest. And again, you find the roots in the infrastructure platform of power generation provided by hydroelectric power at the time, built under Roosevelt's initiatives, were accelerated and facilitated and developed under Roosevelt's initiatives. Again, think about this: infrastructure investment, the Grand Coulee Dam, the Bonneville Dam, additional hydroelectric power systems throughout the Northwest created this potential where private enterprise came in, industries came in, they utilized the ability now to have this low cost, cheap, abundant electricity available to develop new industries, new material development, and you created a whole industry that's now, has led the world to a significant degree for many, many, many years, all coming out of that original infrastructure investment. Third component, water projects. I think it's sufficient to highlight California. Obviously, that it's California suffering now under the insane policies of the governor there, but also the national policies have been devastating for the state as well. But until the more recent generation or two, water development in California was really leading the leader in the world in terms of demonstrating what you can do with major water projects. You had the Central Valley project started again at the time of the Roosevelt administration. And this particular map might be a little complex to see, but you have here shown all the dams, all the reservoirs, all the canal systems, the regions that are irrigated by this water, and the municipal water project areas, all shown on one map in California. You can get hopefully a sense, at least, how complex and how developed the water infrastructure in California is. So this really didn't start with the Central Valley project. You had earlier projects, especially in Southern California, but the major project that really got a lot more going was the Central Valley project, shown here in red. And then starting in 1960, you had the California State Water Project, adding even more, to the point that the Central Valley of California became, through these water projects, it was transformed from being a semi-arid, not desert, but semi-arid region. You can get a sense from this picture here, just what the kind of landscape looked like in terms of, kind of grassland, dry. With these canal systems, water management systems, transform this land to become one of the most productive agricultural regions in the entire planet. Right here, you can see a couple of canal systems that are part of the California Water Project, stretching, emanating into the northern central part of the Central Valley. On less than 1% of the total farmland in the United States, less than 1% of the total farmland of the United States, the Central Valley, the California Central Valley produces 8% of the nation's agricultural output per volume, right? So they have or by value, they have an 8-fold higher rate of productivity per land area in this region. It just wouldn't exist without the water projects, right? Pretty clear example, right? The ability for agriculture to exist, and then all the economic activity goes along with that, that feeds into that, all created by these water projects, right? So this is how the nation was built. This is how we should be thinking about infrastructure, what infrastructure means, what it does, right? As Mr. LaRouche said, it's not a convenience. It's not about fixing that pothole or just being able to get somewhere a little bit quicker, right? It's not a convenience issue. It's the significance of infrastructure is what is the next level of development that's going to create all kinds of new potentials that didn't exist prior to that investment. Obviously, we need to fix what we have. We need to maintain what we have. Our bridges need to be repaired. A lot of our canals, our locks and dams need to be repaired. There's a lot of repairs that need to be done to the existing systems because we failed to maintain them. and so on. That needs to happen, but that's not really going to generate the kind of economic growth and transformation that we need, that's required right now, right? What's needed is new leaps to higher levels that will give the kind of growth that will allow us to advance overall. So just to return to Mr. LaRouche's view on this, infrastructure enables mankind to increase the quality and qualitative feature of productivity of labor as a qualitative step upward. Infrastructure as such, when it's applied in this way to mankind, introduces a qualitative leap upward in the possibility of productive economy. That is, agriculture and industry depend for their improvements based largely on the factor of basic economic infrastructure as I've just defined it. So this is the background, the general conception. Where do we need to go today? What should we be fighting for, right? Infrastructure, in a positive sense, as a good investment, as we all know, I'm sure, is not the Green New Deal. It's not the crap we're getting in these bills from Congress, right? At best, you have some people trying to get some repairs in there, repair some of our existing systems. That's about as far as they go. At worst, you have the Green New Deal, you have the climate, crazy climate agenda, right? Demonizing CO2, the backbone of the biosphere, with plants and love as this supposed pollutant, and a program that would devastate the economy, right? That has to be defeated. But so that's not a real infrastructure program. What do we need? So if we keep just in terms of power, water, and transportation, just to give you a sketch, according just to the history of the United States, what's happened, what brought us here, what made us the leading nation in the world at a certain point, what kind of investment and growth brought us here. If we were to continue that process, revive that process, right? Keep on the same track that brought us to where we are today, let alone the last generation or two of bad policies. We kind of let that be forgotten as a temporary interlude, but return to the kind of policies that built this country. It's pretty clear in generalities where we need to go, right? We want to talk about power, energy, electricity, but energy more broadly. We're probably talking about over the next generation needing a 50–60% increase in the total energy consumption per person in the economy. And that should be primarily driven by nuclear energy, right? Let fossil have its place, let coal, natural gas, the infrastructure is there. We've developed the capability to utilize that. Keep doing it. We don't need to shut that down. But that's not going to provide the base load of growth over the next generation and generations in the future. That is going to be nuclear. That can immediately be nuclear fission power. We have excellent technologies already implemented, already in use that we need to continue to develop and utilize. There's new technologies for nuclear fission, and we have fusion on the horizon, right? So, I would estimate, just by rough estimates here, you probably want, again, an overall increase of about 60% in the total electricity or energy consumption, not just electricity, energy consumption per capita for the economy as a whole over the next 30 years or so in the next generation, bringing us to a point where nuclear power provides about half of that total energy, right? So massive investment, increasing the energy availability per capita, lowering the cost of the energy available, increasing the reliability, which will create the basis for massive economic development to revive manufacturing and so on. This is what you need on the power side. You want to talk about water? We've long been proponents of NOWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, which would be kind of the next logical step in the extension of the development of the western half of the continent in terms of water supplies, connecting Alaska all the way down into northern Mexico, creating a massive water transfer and water management system, right? A lot can be said on that. We've done many discussions on that. That would take some time. We at this point, we probably need to much more rapidly also develop desalination systems. Here you see a picture of the interior of a desalination plant, which takes salt water, ocean water, salt water from the oceans, removes the salt and produces fresh water. We should be building these immediately up and down the entire California coast to begin to address the water crisis there. At the same time, I don't have it shown as an image here, but also there's very fascinating new capabilities of weather modification systems, which could be utilized to help increase the rainfall, increase the precipitation where we need it, even inhibit precipitation where we don't need it, right? Being able to manage the water cycle in the atmospheric aspect, in addition to just managing the rivers once the water's on land and it's flowing through the river system, to actually begin to manage the water in the atmosphere, control the atmospheric trends and activities of the water cycle. Again, another big subject, but I think it's going to be critical if the United States and the world is serious about addressing the water needs. That is a very going to be a very important part of the whole process, which we've covered in a lot more detail in other places. And to round off the big three: power, water, transportation. If we want to just again continue the natural, historical, evolutionary progression of transportation systems throughout the United States, high-speed rail, but in particular magnetic levitation, really is the frontier step, right? And we should be looking at building out regional and then continental, intercontinental high-speed maglev train systems, which can travel at hundreds of miles per hour, things that can handle passenger and freight much more quickly, much more efficiently, and continue that trend of changing those isochronic lines of transportation throughout the country, where you can lower the cost of transportation for goods, for economic activity, increase the sphere of interaction of the average individual in society, right? And develop the country in that sense. So, a national high-speed rail grid along those lines, led by maglev as the backbone technology, would be the next frontier step in that sense. So then take all these together, right? A generational investment in massive nuclear power, solving all of our water issues, not just alleviating the crisis, but providing new water supplies as needed for more growth, more agricultural development, more urban development, more economic development, and providing a modern, massive transportation system to facilitate further economic growth. To return to our theme, this creates the potential to have a productive economy in the future. Without this kind of investment, we don't have the potential to have the growth that we need over the next coming period, right? So this is how we should be thinking about infrastructure, right? This does not happen by letting the free market run its course, and whatever individual people want to buy, sell, whatever, that whole free market mindset is not what built this country. What built this country under the American system was this kind of perspective: increase the productive powers of labor. How do we need to invest to increase the capability of our economy, to develop our territory, to develop the ability for our private entrepreneurs, our productive workers, to be effective, to be efficient, to develop new industries, to develop new technologies, right? This is the kind of program that's built this country, and this is what we need to return to if we're going to save this nation. So I think that's probably good to open up the discussion. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts on that. I'm happy to get into it.